Alright, so I know it's my favorite, and I know it's some of your guys' favorite, but come on, dude. There has to be more than one killing in Ireland that you've have covered, right? I think I've seen every single one of your videos, and I only know of one. Stop picking on Greely or Colorado or places like that, Florida. Dang you, Mike. Nah, nonetheless, man, I still love your content. You know how to rock it. Dude, trust me, I'm a champion for you. Every time I tell people, hey, if you're checking this out on here for the first time, go to his page, show him some love, subscribe. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and play one of his next videos that he made. Another one focused here in Colorado. It's, yeah, I mean, I think the further up north you go, yeah, something's in the water for psychos. So, here we go.
Hey you and welcome, my name is Mike, and in this old video I am taking you back to a little old town that we've been to a couple of times before, so look forward to reminisce on that one, and that is the town of Greely, Colorado. This is our third time there.
Third time.
And it's not a big place, so I don't know how they're pulling this off. Greedy old Greely, greedy for that chapter.
Okay, so let me tell you this. He kind of got that a little wrong. Greeley is a college town. They have the University of Northern Colorado, not to be mistaken with the University of North Carolina. But there are quite a bit of people there, college kids. Surrounding area is just all farmland, and it reeks of manure constantly. Unless you've been up there like I have all my life on and off, you kind of get used to the smell after a while. It just, you don't even pay attention to it anymore. But yeah, Greeley, Colorado, it's gotten pretty big in size over the last few years. So just wanted to clear that up.
After time, it appears it's not just bananas, it's apples and oranges too. This one more so maybe even than the other ones. This all began when a musician named Scott Sessions, he did not show up for a session at a venue he was supposed to. He was a what's a jazz man, a trumpeter. He was the heart and soul of the music scene in Greeley. So when he failed to show up to a session, a gig one night, people began to wonder. Then they began to look. Then they found. What happened? Well, that question would be answered pretty quickly. But the who and the why of it, that would be a tougher nut to crack. Especially when who's the victim and who's the suspect. Let's give it a go! So the town of Greely, Northern Colorado. I mean, we got Randy Baker was there, Shauna Nelson, the dog-faced woman, was there. If you want to learn more about Greely, just watch them. I'm pretty sure I talked enough about it then. So, rinse and repeat. Maybe I'll just insert the section from the other video in here. So, like, what can I say about Greely that I haven't really said before a year ago when I made that? Time flies, Jesus. Population? Talking about, like, maybe 100,000 people, but what's really interesting the city of Greely is that, nah, who cares? You did not come here for the geography lesson, and don't worry, I'm sure my notebook, Greely will be seen again. It's like at the end of a James Bond movie. Let's dive into this old one. Diving in means going to February 2020 and popping into the thriving, boppin', maybe even boopin' music scene in Greely. If you were a musician, you more than likely would have interacted with Stanley Scott Sessions. 53-year-old Scott, he was at every gig with his huge sense of humor. He was always performing. He was one of the hearts of the very scene itself. He cared about it a lot. He brought the passion every day. He was supportive of the acts and of the arts. The trumpet was his instrument, and he was very talented, performing in several bands such as the Movers and Shakers and the Elvis Experience Band.
I'm so sorry, excuse me.
Music was his passion, though to pay the bills he had his painting company. Scott was born in March 1966 in Ogden, Utah, and he moved to Greely when he was young, going to high school there and later getting a degree in music from Brigham Young. And so, when Scott failed to show up for a gig with the Elvis Experience Band on the 10th of February, well, that was like extremely unlike old Scotty over here to miss a session. That is when our story begins. The gig, though, went on without their trumpeter, and then, though later, people realized, hey, where's Scott? Like, it's, again, it would take a lot. Like, music was his #1 priority, pretty much at all times. So then people were like, well, if he's not here, that's odd. Oh wait, I've actually seen Scott in like 2 days, since the 8th of February. So the next day, a bandmate of Scott's named George and Scott's dad, they went over to Scott's house in Greely, knocking on the door, seeing what's going on. Now, at this point, Greely was in the middle of a blizzard, so it was pretty wild outside, I guess, if you want to say that. They went over, they knocked. No answer. In fact, it looked like he hadn't been there for a couple of days. So where had Scott sessioned off to? That question was unanswerable. Give me 2. It'll be answerable now. On a remote road 1 hour west of Greely, at around 9:30 a.m. on the 10th of February, this call was made.
I'm on the Pingree Park Road at the Monument Gulch exit, and I have a dead body.
Okay, we'll get help on the way. Are you able to provide any details?
Well, there was a tree on fire, and I went up to put it out, and he's laying next to it.
Okay, and you believe he's beyond any help?
Yeah, he's definitely passed away.
God, that would be scarring.
That was, as I said, in the boonies, in a remote side of... Not even a remote side of town, in the remote part of the remote part, an hour west. A snowplow driver had seen smoke off the road, and so he pulled up and he plodded over to see what he could see. There he found a tree smouldering, and beside was an extremely charred corpse, covered in snow. It had been wrapped in a blue blanket that was secured with duct tape. Tire tracks were also visible in the snow, so that's how he got there. And it would be determined to be Scott Sessions.
Killed himself?
Now, the body was quite crispy, to say the least, but the medical examiner was able to determine how Scott had died before he had been set on fire. It appeared that Scott had been attacked with a sharp instrument from behind. Whatever happened to Scott, he'd been, it was a surprise, what a surprise, He had been stabbed, he had defensive wounds, so there had been a fight, whoever ambushed Scott, and then his head had been almost cut off. Somebody had sawed through.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
So now you got this beloved musician, well known around town. For good reason, he kept the music scene alive. And now he was, well, not that. A charred corpse in the middle of nowhere. Not a great start here. With no clues around him to indicate what had happened here, the crime scene was taped off, and Scott's life would be uncovered from head to toe. And so the investigation began with going to Scott's house and to try and determine, he was last seen on the 8th, right? Who had he been talking to? Whom had he been talking to? Where had he gone, and to or with whoever? Now, his car was missing from his house in Greely, so whatever happened, it didn't happen at his home. He'd gone somewhere unsuspecting, most likely. There was no signs of any disturbance or violence in Scott's house. Now, near Scott's computer, he had handily written out all his passwords, so thanks, Scott. And then the police were like, well, maybe we'll check out his social media. See who he's been talking to, who's the last person he spoke with. And it turned out the last person Scott Sessions had spoken with was Heather Frank, his new girlfriend. They had only been dating a couple of weeks after meeting at, well, where else? A jazz performance. This was so recent that no one even knew about it. They were at that stage where, they're just dating. It's so fresh and so fragile, you don't really want to go around announcing it. So if asked, no one would have directed the police to, oh, maybe he went to be with his girlfriend. No one was aware of it. Now, Heather Frank, 48 years old, was a server at a diner, Doug's Day Diner in Loveland, just 30 minutes from Greely. Heather was also the mother of 3 boys. Friendly, charming, and a huge jazz fan, hence her going to the show and yada yada yada. Now Heather, she had a history of alcohol abuse, bit of a heavy drinker. Scott wasn't so much, but she was a lovely woman who was able to put it behind her. So Heather was the last person Scott had spoken with. She lived in Greely, pretty much downtown Chester Brown. So the last time Scott was seen was on the 8th of February. Okie dokie. In fact, one of the last people the police were aware of that he spoke to was his dad, saying he was going to go visit a friend. That night, the Saturday night, the 8th, when he was last known to be alive, last seen, he'd been talking to Heather. She messaged him at 5:13 p.m. saying, "Wanna come over?" Followed by, "Sure, I just need to hop in the shower." Fuck yeah. Hurry. That text had been sent from Heather's phone, but it hadn't been sent by Heather. And speaking of two things, one is don't do what Scott did and write down all your computer passwords where anybody can get them. That's a really bad idea because it can lead to the second thing which happened in this story so far, speaking to someone who is not who you think they are. And so with that, this whole video is brought to you by Aura, my friends. It's an app designed to keep feet or your to be evidence where Aura passwords so. Aura will automatically do. I'm talking and password manager. If you sign up Aura.com, by how much of your private information is out there. But it's better you know, I guess. But at least Aura has your back, like I do, when I give you a nice little massage. Now back to it. So the police were tracking Scott Sessions' last known movements to his girlfriend's house, which was not too far away. She had a nice little house there at the end of a cul-de-sac. But interestingly enough, across the avenue from Heather's home was a little mall. There was a liquor store, a video game store, ice cream, shit like that. And a car park, where Scott's car was found. If he indeed drove his car, from his own house to Heather's house, why not park outside her house? Well, what if it had been moved, but not by Scott? Luckily, because someone parked it in a public car park, there was CCTV. It indeed showed a person parking Scott's car on the 11th of February, the day after Scott's body had been found. We're looking at a potato, you could not tell who parked it, but this person never went back to the car. The car was unlocked, and the floor mat was outside the car, directly under the driver's seat. Now that was near Heather's home. But what was in Heather's home? Well, the police were thinking what you were thinking. Scott goes to meet his new girlfriend. It turns out she's a crazy person, and well, yeah. That was one theory, but the police, they wanted to do some some reconnaissance of the place where Scott went and probably didn't leave breathing. They set up surveillance outside the home and tracked down the cars parked outside, who owned it, and such. One car was Heather's. Wow, no surprise there. She's parked outside her own house. Another car, though, that was parked outside was registered to one Kevin Eastman. Now, who was he? Well, Kevin was an on-again, off-again boyfriend of Heather's. Years. I'm talking years. For work, he was an oil field buckaroo, but for pleasure, it seemed beating the shit out of Heather. The police had been called on him numerous times. He even had an active warrant out of Denver for said abuse. So what was he doing back in Heather's house? I thought she was dating Scott. Were they back in one of their on-again moments? Well, another thing the police learned, tracking Scott, tracking phone signals, was that on the night of the 8th of February, the day he went there, they could tell who was in Heather's home at the time. And it wasn't just Scott and Heather. Kevin had been there too. So did Heather lure Scott in? With Heather there, were Heather and Kevin gonna murder Scott and do nothing about it? Who knows how these things work? But it seems unlikely that Scott knew his new girlfriend's ex-boyfriend was going to be there. They never mentioned it in any of the messages they sent between each other. And CCTV would also be located, showing Kevin's car driving to and from where Scott's body was found. So, the police were watching Heather's house, and they saw Heather and Kevin coming and going, acting like everything was completely normal, even though Scott had likely just been killed in their home. It seemed like they were in cahoots together. They had murdered Scott for some bizarre, batshit, unexplained as of yet reason. But they were living like normal. Heather was going around, she was doing shopping, she was getting her nails in. Heather went to work just like she always did. Now, other employees at her diner would say she did seem a bit distraught, a bit upset, but she never mentioned anything weird about going on, like, oh hey, my new boyfriend was just brutally murdered.
Jeez.
Warrants were then issued for both Heather and Kevin. It was then, just as the warrants were issued, surveillance saw both Heather and Kevin get into his car and drive. Trackers were placed on the car, and they told the police they drove 20 minutes away to the property of a guy named Troy, a local businessman and acquaintance of Kevin. Kevin had worked for him here and there a couple of times. The property was out of town, remote. So why were they going there? Well, the next morning, the following morning, the police went out there to see what they could see. What was Kevin and Heather doing out there? Well, Kevin was seen there, witnessed standing beside a burn pit. It's like the same strategy all over again. Kevin was then tailed to a gas station where he was alone and filling up gas tanks. He was arrested then and there, but where the hell was Heather? Well, it didn't look good for Kevin when on his person he had a bloody big knife. He also had some bullets and 2 spent shell casings. Kevin was then questioned by the police, who thought this is looking no bueno. Scott is dead, Heather is gone, and he was building another fire. Kevin then began to tell a sad story for him.
So when was the last time you actually saw Heather?
It was yesterday. We went to, yeah.
So she lives at, 2162 35th Avenue Court? Okay, I'm gonna write that down so I don't forget it, 35th. Okay, and is she there now?
Do you know what time it is?
It is almost 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday.
No, she's at work.
Okay.
Yeah, I asked her to marry me. Yeah. Yeah, but I asked her to marry me. And she said, there's no way she can marry me.
Okay.
And so I just...
How'd that make you feel?
deflated.
He said he hadn't seen Heather in a day after he had a fight where he asked her to marry him and she said no. Then she just took off. He said he never met this Scott fella. Who are you on about? Jazz can go fucking suck me bollocks.
And I'm sure that you've probably heard or seen stuff in the news about somebody disappearing from Greely. Do you know anything about that?
Is it the musician? Yeah, there was something that happened between them.
Okay.
And yeah.
I can tell just based on your facial expressions that you know some stuff that's going on that you want to talk about.
He wasn't even there that night when his phone said he was, but he did have an excuse for maybe something happened. Maybe Heather did something. Maybe Scott attacked Heather and she self-defense.
Well, I remember she started crying. It's real personal. I really felt sorry for her. It came out that she had intimate relations with him.
Okay.
And that it wasn't like really... Oh, man. I'm trying to think of the right words, but it wasn't mutually agreeable. It's kind of how she made it sound.
Okay.
But who knows? Well, maybe the big guy upstairs does for sure, because Kevin decided to get a bit of a hand by having a bit of an El Prey.
Let me help this man get to the bottom of this case, please. Please keep Heather safe.
We know that he was with you and Heather the night before at Heather's house. And then we found him on Monday in Pingree Park. Why don't you just say his name? You can say his name. Scott. Okay? You're having a hard time saying his name.
Yeah, like I never did it, dude.
You met him Saturday night.
No,
Kevin,
I don't remember meeting him. I don't.
And so while detectives were questioning Kevin, police were searching the remote location where the burn pit was, where Heather may have last been. They were also searching Heather's apartment. What exactly had gone on in Heather's apartment for 7 full days, from when Scott was murdered there on the 8th to when Kevin and Heather left on the 15th. Heather's body was eventually found on the property. She had been shot twice in the chest.
Oh, wow.
After, she had been wrapped up and hidden under dry wood that had been scheduled to be burned. I guess Kevin wanted to slip that one in there. Well, police who were interviewing in the chest. Heather's body was eventually found on the property. She had been shot twice in the chest.
Wow.
After, she had been wrapped up and hidden under dry wood that had been scheduled to be burned. I guess Kevin wanted to slip that one in there. Well, police who were interviewing Scott got the word she had been found while in the room.
Drove up there, and what did you do? You guys parked.
I just remember going to Glen Echo.
Kevin, are you covering for Heather?
Did Heather do something?
Was Heather defending herself against this guy? You went over there. She freaked out.
They let him have it.
There was a mess, and being the devoted partner you are to her,
You helped her, didn't you?
you cleaned up Heather's mess.
It's okay.
These are messages from Heather to Scott.
Oh, please.
No, it's not detailed. It's not detailed.
No, I don't want any of it.
Kevin.
That's no, please.
Kevin,
She just asked him to come over. Okay?
these are the messages from Saturday night.
But you know what happened on Saturday night?
Reminded.
You couldn't turn a blind eye. Because Heather put you in a bad spot. You could no longer turn a blind eye on her behavior and the fact that she was with a guy that didn't deserve her. This is your opportunity to say, hey, I know what this looks like, guys, but you know what? I was in a bad situation. Scott made me do this. Heather made me do this. I didn't have a choice. Yeah, we were together all night. All 3 of you were there at Heather's house that night. That's not disputable, Kevin. All 3 of you.
Yeah, I'm not disputing because it's not true. I'm sorry,
It's
guys. There's
You were setting this guy up. You were going to ambush him.
why would I say I'm up? Why would I care?
Because
Forgive me for
she's
saying it,
having
but she's a whore. That's what she does.
She
all
was
the
having sex with
time.
him, and it was the final straw. You set this guy. Kevin, I'm just telling you what some people might say.
Right.
You set this guy up. You lured him to Heather's house. You killed him. Okay? But you know what? I don't think that's what happened. I don't think you lured him there with the intent to kill him. Okay? But some people are going to say that. I think what happened is you were put in a bad situation. And you did what any devoted man would do.
I wasn't even there, guys. You're right, I didn't even go anywhere. I'm just saying I did to cover somebody's ass. Can I get a lawyer?
I'm sorry, guys.
Thank you.
You know, I actually kind of wonder if Kevin actually did simply just lose his mind and he didn't know what he had done. The whole situation is extremely creepy and horrific for Heather. I imagine it is true that Kevin killed Scott. He forced Heather to remain in the house with him for a week, living a little, lovely little married couple lifestyle while she's in absolute terror the entire time, with just wanting to do whatever Kevin said so that he wouldn't get out the knife again. And then he did actually ask her to marry her and marry him, and she said, she respectively declined, and so the rage Kevin had unleashed upon Scott, he did on her. A huge pool of blood was found under the carpet in Heather's house. That was Scott's. Heather was dating Scott, and Kevin had decided to win her back. They had actually only broken up with a month before Heather and Scott got together. Heather and Scott got together in January 2020. She'd broken up with Kevin in December. So maybe Kevin came over to her house one day. He was like, "Give me one more chance, babe." Or Kevin knew that his ex, that he was never going to let go, was dating a new man, dating Scott. And he just wouldn't have it. He just wouldn't have it. He texted Scott from Heather's phone, or he made Heather do it to lure Scott over where he would ambush him. Hiding behind the door, maybe, when he made Heather open it for Scott. stabbing him in the back, and then almost cutting his head off. Then he lived in the house with Heather for a full week. Her obviously in tremendous fear, worried that he'll do the same to her or to her 3 boys. So she would go along, obey Kevin. Oh yeah, I do actually love you. Ha 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 ha. I just think you're great. Maybe she didn't go to the police because she was worried what Kevin might do to her or her sons. And then Kevin thinking, oh, finally I have the happy life, he always wanted. Obviously a total illusion when he asked her to marry him and she said no. That broke the illusion, and so he had to take her out to a remote field, and well, yeah. I also gotta say how infuriating this whole thing is. The police were surveilling Heather and Kevin. Heather was alive. If the police had just acted faster and actually questioned them at the time, they could have saved Heather instead of just watching them for a couple of days until he killed her. If they hadn't waited around, Heather wouldn't have been killed by Kevin.
That is true.
Kevin Eastman was arrested and charged with the murders of his ex and her new boyfriend. He went on trial in 2020. In jail while awaiting trial, he also somehow turned into an old woman.
These hands brought danger, destruction, and death. These hands killed Scott Sessions and Heather Frank, wrapped their bodies in plastic, set one on fire, and was preparing to burn the other. These hands are the hands of the murderer. These are the hands of the defendant, Kevin Eastman.
It was a largely, even with all this though, it was a largely circumstantial case. I mean, they had Scott's blood on some of Kevin's clothing, and they had Kevin's DNA on the shroud that covered Heather's body, but that was kind of really it. The defense though took aim at Heather, that she was the killer of Scott, like Kevin's story, that Scott had attacked Heather, tried to sexually assault her, and so she, whoops, took him out, get him back. And then she killed herself and buried her own body under a big pile of wood. It's impressive.
So investigators assumed Mr. Eastman was with his phone at Miss Frank's residence, and cell phone records from Mr. Eastman reflect that his phone, again, never left her residence that evening or that afternoon earlier, and neither did hers. So when looking at the phone records that indicated Mr. Sessions, Mr. Eastman, and Miss Frank were all at her residence all at the same time before Mr. Sessions was last heard from, of course, Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank were the obvious suspects. And arrest warrants for both Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank were issued by law enforcement. But investigators didn't arrest Mr. Eastman or Miss Frank immediately. Instead, they set up the pole camera outside of Miss Frank's residence to record nonstop. They put GPS tracking devices on both Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank's vehicles, and investigators watched every single move of Mr. Eastman and Miss Frank's from February 14th on. And the GPS tracker, as did cell phone records later obtained, show that Miss Frank went on her normal day-to-day activities. She drove herself to and from her job in Loveland. She got her nails done on February 11th. She went shopping by herself at Centera, had a normal dinner with one of her sons and his girlfriend, and investigators later talked to that son, and he told them Miss Frank seemed normal. So either Miss Frank witnessed or committed a gruesome homicide where a body was later burned and went on her day-to-day activities as normal.
The defense tried to say it was Troy, the person on whose property Heather was found, that he killed her.
Thank you.
So dispensing with the caption as relates to count number 1, murder in the first degree involving victim Stanley Scott Sessions. The verdict reads, we the jury find the defendant Kevin Dean Eastman guilty of murder in the first degree after deliberation. As it relates to count number 2, murder in the first degree involving victim Heather Frank. The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, Kevin Dean Eastman, guilty.
Kevin Eastman was found guilty on all counts.
Ms. Deborah, anything you would like to say on behalf of your client?
Yes, Judge. I just wish that everyone in the room could have gotten to know the Kevin that we knew. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Eastman, you don't have to say anything. Is there anything you would like to say?
Mr. Eastman does not wish to make a statement at this time. Thank you.
Based on your vicious acts of violence, jealousy, and control, and the taking of 2 precious lives, and thereafter disposing of their deceased bodies in such a disrespectful manner. That's why you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. As it relates to count number 1, with regard to murder in the first degree as it relates to Scott Sessions, the court is going to sentence you to a life sentence in the Colorado Department of Corrections without the possibility of
Wow, his
parole.
defense attorney is really taking
The court is going to award you 883 days of
It's a pretty sick one. Kevin definitely had a very sick mind. I'm sure he took great relish out of trying to live a nice little idyllic lifestyle with Heather. In his mind, I'm sure it was like exactly like that. Oh, finally, you know, this is great. It's like a very sick situation where Heather was just going along with, yeah, whatever you say, pal. Yep, I love you. Sure do. Yep, please don't chop my head off like you did, Scott's. I'm sure he finally thought he had everything he wanted until he said, Heather, marry me, babe. And she said no. Gonna have to shoot you down, pal. And then he saw the only way out was, well, get the gun. The illusion was shattered and the murderous Kevin came out once more for her. Sick bastard. Well, that does it for this whole episode, folks. I hope you found it as fascinating. This story was bad shit. I hope you...
If I could write...